Hello, everyone. This is another part in the Center of Law and Society of Cardiff University's video conversation series. And today, in these special circumstances of year 2020, in lockdown, we have pleasure to host Kim Lane Shepely of Princeton University. Kim is professor of sociology and international affairs in the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. And she just delivered the center's annual lecture on the future of legalist authoritarianism. But today we are here to just have a conversation about socio-legal studies, law and society studies, sociology of law in general. But I cannot but start with a question. Kim, how are you doing in these exceptional times as an academic, as a person, and how do you experience this particular COVID year?
Well, so first of all, everybody is discombobulated, right? Everyone's doing things not as normal. And I've been home for 9 months now. In fact, 2 days ago was our 9 month anniversary since we've been in almost complete lockdown. I live in the US, where, of course, we have very little, shall we say, effective leadership on this point. So the pandemic has been raging out of control. And we were in the middle of it at the very beginning in New Jersey, sort of the New York metropolitan area. And now we're going back to the levels that we had again in April. So literally, most of us are in lockdown, not able to travel. But, technology is an amazing thing. So one thing I've discovered is that I'm traveling, at least in terms of who I'm seeing, much more frequently than I could travel if I had to do it in person. So yesterday I did a seminar in Berlin. This morning I had some meetings at the European Parliament. Here I am talking to you, and I've been able to kind of go through and travel the globe in Zoom. So that part's really good. But my students have been affected, so I think everybody's affected. And my students who were thrown off campus, in March, really were many of them got very depressed. I mean, depressed because they weren't with their friends, depressed because they go back to their parents and their parents haven't realized they've all grown up since they went to college, and it's just been, I think, very, very tough on our students. But so, a lot of us have tried to figure out how do we teach in the pandemic. And, there's some things the pandemic makes better. So, just before we started talking, you got to see my cat. Whenever I'm sitting here talking to myself, because nobody can hear you, I have a little thing in my ear. My cat just thinks I need somebody to talk to. So as soon as I start on Zoom, my cat shows up. All my students know the cat. One of my students adopted a cat who looked like my cat and named him Pierre Bourdieu because we were actually covering Bourdieu in our seminar. So, you get to see people's lives a little bit more. And I think it will really change us all, even when this is over.
Yeah, I agree that this will transform universities, the way we teach, the way we share our research, the way we disseminate it, as you pointed out, and but obviously also care for our students because. Here in Cardiff, they've been magnificent, very understanding, but this lack of face-to-face teaching, this transformation of sociality is really a big burden on all of us. But let me go back to you as a student, perhaps. What particularly drove you to social sciences, political science, and later into law?
Oh, that's such a good question. So, C. Wright Mills always says that, sociology is the intersection of biology and not biology of biography and history. So I think I'll try to approach this question that way. So um, I'm of a certain age where when I was growing up, there were in American cities a lot of uprisings or riots or whatever. It was really alarming to see as a kid that there could be such unrest and people dying, burning buildings, fights with police. And so I got fascinated with cities. And while I was still a high school student, I grew up just outside of Newark, New Jersey, in a suburb that from which you could ignore Newark, New Jersey. But I went into Newark, New Jersey, and I wound up becoming a member of a street gang when I was in high school. And it was an interracial street gang. And it was, how to put it, the guys were the ones committing the illegal acts because there was a gender division. The women were we were just the auxiliary crew that came in after they had knife fights, and we had to find them all in hospitals and so forth. But it was really an eye opener to realize how going 7 miles from where I grew up put me into such a different world. And I think from that moment on, I was a sociologist. But first, I was a journalist. And so I got a job. I'm not sure you could do this now, but I got a job as a kind of summer intern for the local newspaper, and was very interested in Newark still, and opened the Newark bureau office. I covered a lot of criminal trials as a journalist. And that's what got me interested in law, because you began to see very quickly that how things actually worked was not how, A, not what it was, how things were working on television, and B, not how you would expect them to work if you just read the laws. So all of that experience, which I'd had in high school and then all the way through college, I was working as a journalist. So I didn't pay as much attention to college as I should have, because I was constantly out and doing stories and writing my term papers as if I were on a deadline, writing journalism. So, college kind of passed me by in a bit of a blur. And I had a job waiting for me at NBC News. They were opening a new national network for radio, and I had done some radio work also. And so I had this wonderful job waiting for me when I graduated from college. And then I got hijacked. So I was a student at Barnard College in New York to stay in the area and to still be able to cover, Newark and the surrounding areas. And of course, Columbia University, with which Barnard College, was affiliated, had one of the really major sociology departments at that time. And the person who was the star of the show in sociology at Columbia was Robert Merton. And this was shortly before he retired. And he taught this very famous graduate seminar that people would come to from all over the world. And so I'm a journalist, so I'm thinking, well, if all these people are going, I should be able to go. So I was an undergraduate. Undergraduates had to apply to get in. You had to fill out a questionnaire and say, why you were devoted to sociology. And I got an interview with Merton to audition for being admitted to his graduate course. And at one point, I was totally intimidated. He was a faculty member who had a card catalog, old-fashioned, library card catalog in his office so that he could find all of his books. And I remember being very intimidated by all of that. And I walked in and he said to me, "You do plan to go on, don't you?" By which I understood completely he meant getting a PhD in sociology. And I, who had no intention of getting a PhD in sociology because I had this fabulous job waiting for me after graduation, immediately lied and said, yes, of course, I plan to go on. And then I left his office and I thought, oh my God, I just lied to Robert Merton. So I got into the class, and it just transformed my sense of what was possible. He was a spellbinding lecturer. He had this ability to to go between grand ideas and the headlines and, really what looked like insignificant events until he'd thrown this spotlight on them. And I got totally captivated. But in order to prove to him that I hadn't really lied, which of course he didn't know, I had to apply to some graduate programs in sociology just to make it look like I at least had intended to do this. By the time actually the admissions started coming in from the graduate programs, I was totally convinced that this was much more interesting than journalism. And so I wound up in the end telling, NBC News, can you hold the job? Well, I just go get a master's degree and then I'll come back. They actually held that job for almost 3 years, and I never came back.
All
Went
right.
off into graduate school, and there I was.
Wonderful, wonderful. It just reminds me that when we tell students that before we start reading sociology, we already are lay sociologists because we are social beings. So you can be even a lying sociologist and in
Right.
making. Yeah. But
Right. I have to say, I eventually confessed my dissertation book wound up winning a major book prize at the American Sociological Association. And so there's a big ceremony, where you receive the prize and you give, thanks to all the people who helped you out. And in my award speech, I said the opening line was, "I got into sociology because I lied to Robert Merton." And he was sitting in the front row. And I explained this, and he wrote me I mean, afterwards he came up and I mean, he remembered me, but, and we've been in touch, but he sent me the nicest note acknowledging that he forgave me for the lie.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, it's so sociology was a kind of transformative passion for you, and so then you started developing your ideas, and obviously at the intersection of sociology and political science. And so, what was then driving you increasingly towards law?
Well, so here too, again, the intersection of history and biography. So actually, when I started grad school, I mean, I had, worked with Robert Merton. I'd also worked with Herb Gans at Columbia because I did an urban ethnography for my senior thesis. Got to Chicago, and all the available fellowships for paying for graduate education required that you do quantitative work. So I figured, okay. So actually, when I was in grad school, I took 12 courses in the math department, and I was working at the National Opinion Research Center, and I wrote a book co-authored with Art Stinchcomb and Carol Heimer and a number of other people. And I did only quantitative work in graduate school. Kind of drifted very far from my initial theoretical interests, but that's what fellowships will do. And then I got to designing my own dissertation, and basically, I was the only girl around. Basically, if you're doing, I mean, first of all, because there were so few women at the time, I had 0 women professors through graduate school and law school, certainly not in the math department, not in sociology, not in law. And as I started to formulate my own research, you could only do quantitative research if you were working with, at the time, mainframe computers and big teams. And as the only girl on the team, well, let's see, I had one research proposal stolen from my desk. I had a professor that I was trying to work with on one of these other teams try to rape me after a seminar. I had, anyway, tons of sexual harassment all the way around. And I began to realize, the future for women on these big team projects is not very promising. So I wandered over to the law school kind of on a whim. And at Chicago Law School, it was when it was, this is the height of the Chicago law and economics movement. At the law school, they didn't notice if you had a body. It was the most liberating thing ever. I mean, it was brutal, sort of intellectually. I mean, you get grilled and grilled and pressed on everything. But it was so refreshing that they didn't seem to notice I was a girl. So
Hmm.
I kept taking all these law classes. It was just a much more supportive place, and my research shifted into socio-legal studies.
That's very interesting and of course disturbing to hear. Is it where when you refer to the street gang and the girls' job, boys' job,
Yeah,
and here again, yeah, that basically
yeah,
academics behaving like gang leaders, and is it
right.
something which also uh, uh, initiated your long-time interest in gender studies?
Absolutely. So here was the problem, and I think it's still a problem for women in academia now. You can either work on, quote, women's issues or gender issues. Now, of course, the category of gender is much improved, much broadened, and made much more flexible. But there's a certain kind of stereotyping that happens when you work on gender issues. And so what I've done through much of my career is to have a gender project and then projects that are in the middle of stuff that only guys do, and to do them kind of in parallel. Um, and that was true in grad school. I wrote again, a master's thesis on, because I was back in my quantitative days, on the willingness of American voters to vote for a woman for president, for example. I also did a study with a feminist sociology professor from another university. I went to the University of Chicago. Um, we did a big study of rape victims, and particularly interested in women who had gotten attacked but managed to avoid being raped, and to compare their strategies with the strategies of rape victims. So I had all that sort of gender work going on, while at the same time I wrote a book on attitudes toward the death penalty with a team of that was actually both women and men, but was very quantitative. And my dissertation was on secret keeping. It was turned into a book called Legal Secrets, which didn't have much of an official kind of gender component, but which I think has a kind of gender sensibility through it. So I've always kind of had these two different lines of work going simultaneously.
Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating to listen to this personal, this biography and this personal history, which and professional history, which sounds so different to the British socio-legal community. That in the US, it's mainly social and political scientists driven into law because the law offers some extra value or is an interesting object of research, if not desire. And it's different because here in the United Kingdom, it's mainly lawyers disenchanted with black letter law and looking beyond the law and going into interdisciplinary studies who form the socio-legal community. But enough of these UK-US distinctions and differences, because you're one of those scholars who have truly global portfolio, but of course every global insight has some local experience. And in early 1990s, you decided to move to Central Europe and in particular to Hungary. This is where we first met. And I'm curious to hear yeah,
Yeah.
what drove you to post-communist and to Eastern Europe in general and to Hungary in particular, if I may ask?
Yeah, such a good question. But let me first say something about the UK-US difference. So in most of the world, a law degree is your first degree, and it's the degree you need to practice. So it batters you with black letter law. In the US, there is no first degree in law. You have to have a first degree in something else. So every law student is almost by definition interdisciplinary. And I think that really changes the way law school feels, and it changes the way the scholarship looks, in American law schools. So you don't have to make the separate case that you need training in some other field. In fact, American law schools don't let you avoid getting training in some other field. So I think that makes a difference, even though they're both common law cultures and share a common legal history. But I should say that the person who got me really embedded in socio-legal studies was a Brit. So Brian Simpson, better known as AUWB Simpson, I had him as a teacher in the first semester he taught in the United States. And it just completely, that I thought that's what made me move much more toward law, was his account of, I mean, he's a legal historian, but again, a fabulous socio-legal historian. And I could see ways you could mix disciplines working on doctrine. I've always thought doctrine was a great object of sociological study, and that inspiration came from him. So that also opened up my view. I mean, having Brian as a teacher also opened up my thought that maybe staying in the US was a little narrow.
Mhm.
And so my first toe in the water, I should say, I was such an American. I didn't get a passport until I was 30. Okay, now that's really common in the US. I mean, More than half of Americans never get a passport. Okay, so
We had passports in former communist Europe, but we couldn't use them.
yeah, okay, well, we could have them, but nobody gets them. So, we should think about that as a kind of sociological problem. But I'd never gone abroad except you could go to Canada without a passport, just with, national ID. But I didn't really go abroad until after I got my first teaching position. So I was very late to the international game. And I say this because for, all of your students, for example, who, have stayed rather close to home, now that Brexit is closing everyone in a little bit more, let's hope that you guys escape this as, with a cosmopolitan option. But just because you've worked at home for so long doesn't mean you can't radically change your view. So first I went to Scotland for a year. Actually, I lived in Edinburgh for a year, and that was already just completely novel because of course you have to relearn English in Scotland because it's a different language. And I loved it. And that was really a big inspiration. But then, of course, the Berlin Wall came down, and I had never been to Eastern Europe. I mean, what was then called Eastern Europe, and now that's a politically incorrect term, But the former journalist in me kind of woke. I just gotten tenure, so I had more, like now what? Pigs could fly. What would you do? And so the wall came down. The former journalist in me kind of woke up and said, "This is the biggest event of my lifetime." And it turns out when I kind of look back on my life, I realized that my best friend growing up was a woman who came from a Hungarian Jewish family. And her family had books and they listened to classical music and they went into New York for plays. And my family was not like that at all. They were as American kind of technocratic class as you could get. I saw my friend Lori and her family. And so I kind of got myself adopted by them. So even though I'm not ethnically Hungarian at all, I wound up growing up in this family. They didn't speak the language. They were a couple of generations away from that. But still, in retrospect, that's how I learned like all of culture and good things came with that family. My best friend in college she was a second generation Lithuanian. And her family barely spoke English. And when I would go to stay with them, we learned all this stuff. And then there was the moment when she discovered in going through her father's like kind of trunks that he had a Nazi uniform. So then it was like, oh, wow, right. So there was the Holocaust history, there was the fascist history from the other side. And then my best friend in graduate school had grown up actually in Poland. And had only been in the US since he was in high school. And we got to be fast friends. So as soon as the wall came down, my friend Karol said, I can go back to Warsaw now. You want to come with me? So my first trip to Eastern Europe came with my best buddy Karol, and we went to Warsaw in 1990. So within a year of the wall coming down. And I thought, great, I'm going to study Poland. And I got there, and this was the moment when the Catholic Church just was like, what had been liberated was more the Catholic Church than the Polish people in some ways. And I got there and it was like way too Catholic for me. So I figured, okay, let me keep traveling and figure out, I want to move here. I want to live here. I want to look at this huge historical transformation up close. And it took me a couple of years to discover Hungary. Again, not quite real. My best friend growing up, I didn't even know her family was Hungarian. I knew that they were Jewish, but I had no idea they had Hungarian roots. Got to Hungary and it felt so much like home. And now I know why. All along, I'd been meant to go to Eastern Europe. So that's why I moved there. Wound up in Hungary, where the Constitutional Court was sort of running the country at that time. And from a base in Hungary, you could sort of go all over the regions. So I moved there for 1 year, stayed for 4, and have never left it in my soul.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, it's interesting because even for us living in Czechoslovakia, Hungary in the second half of the 1980s already looked so different from neo-Stalinist Czechoslovakia, because in Hungary people could travel abroad. You could see books and music that was still heavily censored in Prague or Bratislava. You could go to concerts, and Budapest was always such a lovely and lively place for us. So we also had wonderful memories there. And in early 1990s, of course, Hungary was like the best kid in class of post-communist countries, and yeah, it was the darling of Western diplomats and an exemplar case for democratic transition. So how because you were involved in academic life in Hungary, but also you were quite heavily involved in constitutional transformations. You were an advisor, you were involved. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, that was so yeah. So I went to Eastern Europe with a couple of basic principles. One was that even though everybody, even though these countries in the region were all out from under Soviet influence, what immediately happened was poverty. I mean, that basically what, and Hungary did somewhat better than some of the other countries in the region, but, you look at at the way all these economies crashed, at the way that people's, not exceedingly elaborate but comfortable lives were really shattered. The freedom is sort of, how to put it, it was the Janis Joplin has this song called Me and Bobby McGee, which has a line that says freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. And that was kind of what it felt like to a lot of people in the region. So one principle that I went with was that I would never take money from there because it needed to go to people who live there. So I showed up with a grant from the American National Science Foundation to study the Hungarian Constitutional Court, which was at that time the most activist court in the region. And I went for 1 year. I was able to get that grant renewed. And then I got this position starting the gender program at Central European University, which I only took A, on the condition that I take it half time and share it with someone from the region, and B, under which I was guaranteed that they would never hire only people from the region. So it was a job that was essentially being reserved for someone from outside. So I took that job for 2 years while still working at the Constitutional Court. Now, when you do research, and this is a problem for socio-legal scholars in general, you go in to study, especially if you're studying lawyers, judges, constitutional drafters, and so on. When you go in as an academic studying professionals, there's a question about how far you keep your distance and how far you treat them like colleagues, right? I mean, talking to them about giving your opinion, they give their opinion, etc. So at the Constitutional Court, I spent about a year not saying anything about the content of the decisions.
Okay.
Because I was there to study them. I wasn't there to influence
them. You were
them.
there as an ethnographer. Yeah.
As an ethnographer, right? And so I was just interviewing everybody. And then there was a case that made me break my promise not to get involved. It was a case that came in from a NGO called Sivarvanya, which means rainbow. It was a gay rights group, and it was so closeted that none of the people in the group ever appeared before the court or in the media or in any public setting. They had someone who brought the case for them, a feminist lawyer named Christina Morvai. And it's really interesting because you may know Christina because she was at the time actually working at the European Court of Human Rights. She was then elected by the UN General Assembly to be one of the experts on the CEDAW review committee, the one that sort of assesses whether countries have met their obligations under the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And when she came back to Hungary after, I guess it was after 2001 to 2002, she flipped and was one of the founders of the neo-Nazi Jobbik political party. And then she served some time in Brussels, where she was known as Nazi Barbie in the European Parliament. So people, one thing you learn in this part of the world is that people do have rather unusual career trajectories.
Yes.
But in the 90s, but in the 90s, she brought this first gay rights case to the Constitutional Court challenging the marriage law for discriminating on the basis of gender, and the civil unions law, which she said did the same. And the Constitutional Court entered, like I would every day sort of look at the docket of new cases that had been registered. And those were back in the days when file names needed 8 characters only. For those days. And so everybody was like making up shorthands, and I was new to Hungarian. I was learning Hungarian while I was there. So trying to figure out all the abbreviations in the docket list was always really challenging. But one day I went in and there was a name in the docket list that I knew. I see if I can say it. Hungarians, I will be embarrassed to say this in Hungarian, but the word was busi, which, in English basically means faggot. It's like this really derogatory term for gay people. And I recognized that. And I thought, that can't be. It must have some other meaning in Hungarian. So I went and looked up the case. And sure enough, it was this case. And the reaction of the court was more or less like the reaction of the short name of the file. Like, these people are disgusting, they have no rights, etc. And then I went through this line, walking up and down the banks of the Danube, thinking, do I have an obligation to say something? Or
Mm.
should I just watch them walk off a cliff into, massive human rights violations? And then I thought I should say something. So I
So,
went to the people who had the file and I said, look, this is your opportunity to get out ahead of this big social movement. And
mhm,
the court left marriage law alone, but required civil unions to have an option for same-sex couples. So
okay.
that was the beginning of my involvement, like where I wasn't just a researcher, but was
Okay, so
involved
it
in
is
reading.
an ethnographer who couldn't keep quiet,
Couldn't keep
and
quiet.
the story of and of course it drove you into constitutional politics
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
involvement with people who were part of constitutional transformation. I think we should say that at that time Hungary was really the one of the most advanced countries in what we would call constitutional transformation and democratic transformation.
yeah, yeah.
And but at the same time, I want to stop with the Central European University, because
Great.
we are now 20 years on from since the foundation of the Central European University. And I remember very well that ethos of early 1990s, when George Soros comes and gives this large money, sum of money to set up a new university, which would actually not just symbolize, but which would educate new professional classes, intellectuals. People like Ernest Gellner were heavily involved in
Because there
founding
was a
it.
campus in Prague and a
Absolutely.
campus in Warsaw and one in Budapest. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
exactly.
And you were actually known as that. You mentioned it. So today, of course, George Soros is used as the public enemy number one by the Orban government and by the autocratic or extreme populist politicians in Hungary and to a lesser extent elsewhere in Central Eastern Europe. But you set up studies which were completely unknown then. So could you tell a little bit about that, gender studies in post-communist Europe?
Yeah, so it was a tremendous honor to be asked to form this department. So CEU already decided it wanted to move in this direction. Um, Frankly, I mean, George Soros was Jody Soros, as they say in Hungary. So he, the founding this university was on top of having foundations all over the region, and he had supported during the communist time people who were trying to be liberal, and frankly, you look back at what he's done, and I hope somebody, really takes a big view of his role in this whole transformation from communism to post-communism, and from post-communism to post-post-communism, which is kind of what we're in now, which is kind of the backlash against liberalism that came with all of that. It was really a remarkable feat to set up a university at that time. and to think that you would really need a gender department. So I was asked to come in and do this, and so the question was, what would it look like? And most gender studies, in fact, even the word gender was just an English word that lots of languages in the region were just importing because there was no equivalent of a word that would separate the biological term from the social part of, of, of sex, gender, whatever. So we tried to found gender studies, and the field as it was existing in the US, which I'd been involved in also trying to launch, was very much tied to an American agenda. Women were kept out of the labor force. Women were expected to be housewives and mothers. Women were, uh, uh, I mean, sexual violence is sort of universal, but the problem in post-communist countries was not that. The problem was that women had been forced to work, right? The women, their kids were put in nurseries and they were told they had to work. And, basically everyone had their main meal at lunchtime provided by your workplace, because when you went home, you were going to be exhausted and you weren't going to have any time to deal with your kids. So the set of demands, concrete demands that women had about liberation were demands at being, what philosopher Joseph Raz would call demands of self-authorship, right? It was about choosing what you wanted to do for a change, whereas the problem in the US was really quite different. There had been, quote, free choice. There were just lots of pressures not to do things. So we had to rethink the whole field. So what I thought was that, and also it's Central European University. The thing I love about Central Europe, right, is that intellectual life in Central Europe is like more intense than anywhere else on earth. And so if you came in with a program that kind of looked like activism slash social work, that was just not going to be what CEU, it wasn't what the rest of CEU looked like. So I sat down with my colleagues and we thought, okay, so what are the fields for which gender is essential? And we landed on a set of ideas. One of the central ones was psychoanalysis, which had been, especially in Czechoslovakia, right, one of the most banned subjects. You could not study psychoanalysis. I mean, and a friend of mine from Switzerland, who was a practicing analyst, got arrested in Prague at some point in the 80s. I mean, all of his books confiscated. He spent some time in jail. I mean, so this was, if you looked at the list of banned books, psychoanalysis was right up there. But there is no version of psychoanalysis that does not make gender central. Right. So one aspect of our program was to set up, and psychoanalysis had been in many ways founded in Budapest. Some of our students uncovered archives of Ferenczi and some of the early psychoanalysts. So a big chunk of our program was on psychoanalytic theory. Another big part was sort of gender history. Another big part, this was in the 90s, right? So critical theory. And so I sat down and kind of wrote on the back of an envelope, like, who would be the ideal people to show up? And so I thought, Slavoj Žižek, Judith Butler, Wendy Brown, Gisela Block, Juliet Mitchell, why am I blocking on her name? Yulia Kristeva. So you sort of go through this whole list of people and they all said yes. So we had this department that was like better than any department in the world. I mean, people would come and teach for 2 weeks or a month. I mean, it wasn't a permanent faculty, but I had no authorization to hire a permanent faculty. And so we had just the most astonishing gender program ever at this incredibly high level of theoretical accomplishment. So that put gender studies on the map, and we admitted students. We had to bring in, like, we had 1-year master's students. And again, there were no gender studies programs in the region. So how do you find students when it's not a field anywhere? So by that time, I'd lived in the region long enough to know that one thing academics were missing were sabbaticals. So I said, well, look, why don't we, paying what we had to pay a graduate student to come and take a year's course worth of courses was more than most academic salaries. You could live on this stipend in Budapest. So we advertised the program as a sabbatical program. And all of our master's students came with already having PhDs. So when my colleagues, and I was the only woman on the faculty council, I was the only woman in the leadership of the institution, when my colleagues looked at this department, it had better credentials, more accomplished students. They could not put our program down and get rid of it. given what our faculty look like and given what our students look like. And I'm proud to say the program is still there. It's been driven out of Hungary, but it still exists.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Amazing. Yeah, it's I like what you said about the level of intellectualism in Central Europe, or this cultured environment in Central European intellectual yeah, it's very often the only thing that you have. Yeah, this is how you
Right.
resist the conditions. And
Yeah. Yeah.
but obviously, when you return to the States, and those who follow your work, they can clearly see this trace and this perspective from Central Europe and all those things of democracy and authoritarianism. You mentioned gender, but also constitutionalism. And obviously you were, for a long time, you were part of the University of Pennsylvania, then moving on to Princeton, but you became a very prominent socio-legal scholar, part of Law and Society Association, its president. You received the Pipkin Prize for contribution to the Law and Society Association earlier this year, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And obviously you returned, but you carried on in your constitutional ethnography and studies of constitutionalism in the interdisciplinary context. So how would you say your Central European experiences affected your view of American society, constitutionalism in US, but not only in US, but beyond, transnational and global constitutionalism?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think the best thing I ever did was to move to Central Europe. I mean, A, because you really have to be much better at everything to make any kind of, sorry, my phone is ringing, but you have to be so much better at everything to have a life in Central Europe. So it really, pushed me in lots of really good ways. And the weird thing was that when I moved to Hungary, I was actually teaching political science at the University of Michigan. So my sociology PhD got me a job in political science. You can do that kind of thing in the US, bounce across disciplines, much harder to do in Europe. And I might say that, I hadn't really taught in a law school, but because I worked at the Constitutional Court for 4 years and was publishing in law reviews and really doing very detailed doctrinal analysis, I got this offer to come back and teach full-time at the law school at University of Pennsylvania, precisely because I had gone abroad and suddenly, knew other legal systems kind of from the inside. So fortunately for me, the University of Pennsylvania was interested in having someone who did comparative constitutional law on the faculty. And so I returned to a different city in a different discipline than when I had gone over to Central Europe. And so, that experience of working in a court, of learning the law as it was being constructed, was something that really shaped what I did. And of course, Hungary was kind of the model demonstration case. I mean, both because it had started off ahead because it had done these economic reforms earlier than other parts in the region. It had been the place where almost every international NGO put their headquarters. CEU was a great magnet for intellectuals to come to the region. So Hungary looked like the way to do this transformation successfully. And so it was possible to write about a small country without looking parochial, because Hungary itself was not very parochial. And then actually 9/11 happened. And for a while, like for a decade, my research went off in the direction, because the journalist, right? I'm always tracking what's happening. I went off in the direction of realizing that what I had seen in Hungary in the 1990s, which was this deconstruction of a police state into a constitutional state, separating the military and the police, putting in checks on power, putting in lots of veto points, setting up new independent institutions. What happened after 9/11 in the US and elsewhere was that same process I'd seen in the 90s, but in reverse, right? So almost every country tried to find ways to get their military, their security services, and their police to talk to each other. Almost all independent institutions were bypassed. Places, UK lead among them, right, creates a special terrorism court with separate rules of evidence just after all the countries in Central Europe had merged their court system, and so there were no more political courts.
Yeah.
Suddenly there were political courts again. It seemed like the exact same thing in reverse.
Yeah.
So that's what I went into studying with terrorism. I would never have seen that angle if it hadn't been for the Central European stuff. And then as that calmed down, then Hungary went off the rails, and I bet that's where you're going to go next.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting what you say, because clearly these developments can go one way or the other way, and you are actually writing about legalist authoritarianism and backsliding of democracy long time before the rise of populism, before constitutional changes which open way to the authoritarian rule. And I know that 20 years ago you were interested in these reversions of constitutional developments, and I wonder to what extent it's driven by your knowledge in the region, that of course everybody was building the rule of law to limit government and to avoid arbitrary power and to avoid the tyranny. But at the same time, Central Eastern Europe is the region in the world in which the worst atrocities happened on the basis of laws. Whether it's political trials, whether it's the Holocaust, the culture of legalism ending up in the worst humanitarian disasters are very well known and covered in Austria, Hungary, Germany, Poland. It's part of the region's political gene. So you started
Exactly.
working on this post 9/11 developments, and then of course things started changing in society. And you have this very interesting take on the rise of authoritarianism, because you don't buy into the populist term formula. Can you explain actually this, your critique of populism and what you mean by legalist or constitutional authoritarianism?
Yeah, so the standard, we're seeing a lot of democracies going backwards now, backwards in the sense that there was a kind of view at one point, this idealistic view at one point in the 90s, that once a country became a consolidated democracy, there was no going back. Well, so first we saw with the so-called war on terrorism, the countries were going back, and the question was which ones went all the way back, or went all the way, maybe they hadn't. Well, anyway, which ones sort of collapsed as constitutional democracies and which ones managed to survive. And once you saw that, and I think once a lot of leaders with autocratic ambitions saw that, they began to realize that you could deconstruct a constitutional democracy from the inside while appearing to still be a constitutional democrat, right? You don't cancel elections, and you put all kinds of stuff in constitutions. And so suddenly a kind of toolkit became available. And this was happening at a moment when, partly because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So one of the things the collapse of the Soviet Union did, I mean, how to put it, we don't miss it for most of what it stood for. But what it stood for, if you were in, quote, the West, was an alternative economic model that promised equality and redistribution. And I mean, not in practice as much as, in theory, but, the theory was what people outside of it often saw. And when it collapsed, it left this space for neoliberalism of the most brutal sort to reappear. And when that happened, what it uh, what it did was to kind of make make the political spectrum, which had gone from left-leaning parties in favor of redistribution to right-leaning parties defending private property and merit, which was highly unequal, that no longer seemed like the relevant axis of politics. Nobody was playing on that terrain after Thatcherism, Reaganism, the collapse of communism, and so on. Neoliberalism was the only game in town. And moreover, economies had become so internationally integrated that national policy about redistribution and economic matters was no longer a purely national concern anyway. So I think what we've seen is the displacement of what had been primarily economic-based policies and economic-based politics into a politics in which the most salient division in many countries is between cosmopolitans who live in the world and nationalists who live in local communities. And I want to say that in a way that doesn't put down one side or the other, but says these are different ways of being in the world. And these are now the new politics, where one, well, how to put it, where if that's the new axis, what you'd want is one party to compete primarily on cosmopolitan grounds and another on nationalist grounds. But instead, what's happened is that cosmopolitan nationalist split has occurred within parties of the left and within parties of the right. And it's deconstructed them, right? So there's no better place to see that than in the UK. What is Brexit but a fight in the Tory party between the cosmopolitans and the nationalists? What was the last election with the Labour Party all about? But the fight within the Labour Party, right, between the cosmopolitans and the nationalists. And so what's happened is that political parties have been caught in this struggle as the political axis has shifted from left to right to not to north south, but to cosmopolitan nationalists. And what that's meant is that parties no longer screen the candidates that come through. This is sort of what I was trying to argue, last week. What that's done is it's allowed people who have autocratic ambitions to sneak through the filters, win an election on the basis of, say, a populist appeal, but they're not really populists. They're not in it they don't care about ordinary people. They care about the consolidation of power. So populist ideology is a cover for autocrats to come in, win an election, change the constitution, change all the laws, and then suddenly the next election is no longer free and fair. And we've seen that happen all over the world on both the left and the right. So that's why I think the ideology is the cover, but the ideology isn't where all the action is. And it's that change that was caused. That's why I'm calling this post-communism. Post-communism was about countries that had lived through communism adopting liberalism. Post-communism is about the recognition, wow, there's no more socialism in the world, right? And so, we can't have a party politics based on a kind of, on the old-fashioned left-right spectrum. And as this new spectrum emerges, it creates this opportunity for people cut free of ideology to come in and rediscover authoritarianism.
Yeah. It's also quite fascinating to see how here post-communist Europe is looking at and watching developments in the West and said, our crisis is their crisis. Yeah, that
Right.
our identity politics is now their identity politics, nativists
Exactly.
and cosmopolitans and whatever you name it. But
Exactly.
you emphasize the importance of political parties in the constitutional democratic statehood. And it seems to
Right.
be disappearing everywhere. And this brings me to the final part of this conversation, which is very personal, and at the same time we talk about different themes, different approaches, different experiences. Uh, you your research could be could be labeled as a sociology or ethnography of constitutionalism or democratic constitutionalism. In terms of methods and methodologies, how important do you believe are political science methods for a constitutionalist doing the socio-legal research?
Such a good question. So I've always felt, I mean, as you can see, since I keep going to different disciplines, PhD in sociology, started in political science, moved to law school, now back in sociology. This is the first time I've had an appointment in the field of my PhD in my whole life. It's actually kind of interesting. But basically, disciplines are ways of trapping people, I think. And I think it's always really important to look over the edges of your own discipline into what other fields are doing, right? And so constitutional law without sociology, social theory, political science is just doctrine, right? But, the sociology of law without doctrine isn't really law as lawyers know it, and there's an important, crucial thing left out. So I've always tried to go back and forth between doctrine and what happens in the world.
This is
And
fascinating. Sorry to interrupt you,
no,
but this is so important what you're saying that I have to stop and just
sure,
highlight it that very
sure,
often lawyers or legal scholars think, oh no, we have to be critical of black letter law, of the doctrinal knowledge. And every time I speak to somebody who comes from political science or social science angle and like you or like other colleagues working in sociology of constitutions, they say, oh no, doctrine is so important. It's such a fascinating method to
yeah,
be studied. Yes, so
right,
it's,
right.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, partly that's, but so here, the question is, how does doctrine become social, right?
Yeah.
And so, and this is you and I have talked a little bit about the sort of phenomenology of constitutions. So people who are trained in law think legal concepts are real and they act as if they're real, right? And it goes back to, this guy, William I. Thomas, who said, if men believe men, this is back in those days, if men believe things are real, they are real in their consequences, right? So you act like something's real and you make it so. If you believe the Constitution actually, especially if you're in public office, if you believe the Constitution constrains you, it will. But if you believe it doesn't, or if you believe it's not there, or if you believe it doesn't apply to you, then it can crumble really quickly. And this is what we're seeing in these autocratic legalistic regimes, is that either the Constitution changes from morning to night so that nobody believes it has any force, or the leaders so blatantly violate it that it's clear it has no hold on them, or they can do with constitutions what they do, as we were just discussing, with populism. The new Hungarian constitution has this national populist preamble that traces the entire history of the Hungarian state. And then it goes on to basically give Orban all the power that he could possibly want and more. And so it's important, I think, to realize that these constitutions are are how to put it, they're frames that people live in,
Mhm, mhm.
and the doctrine is the thing that makes it a frame. So you can't ignore the study of doctrine in socio-legal studies.
Yeah.
It has to be there. And you may find, and this is where sort of legal consciousness studies are interesting, that people not trained as lawyers have a very different view of what that is than lawyers. That's quite possible. Or that practicing lawyers have very different impressions than judges about what exactly this law is. But you can't, but there's so many, how to put, it's not possible to live in the world without believing legal categories are real. When I teach sociology of law, I teach a section on like the family. So there's biological stuff, but then there's all the legal recognition of certain kinds of relationships. Those actually have a real meaning. And people, this is why the gay marriage movement has been so important, because if you don't have the legal recognition, there's something you're really missing in that formation. Did it with something like money. Like, why should anyone accept a piece of paper in exchange for a valuable thing? It's because there's a bunch of legal relations that that piece of paper represents. And if they weren't there, you couldn't do that. And
Yeah.
you could go all the way through, almost every institution that we live in, that they're all held up by legal expectations. And they wouldn't be there like that if there weren't any law.
Yeah, yeah, and it's I think the last thing I wanted to ask you about your research and your involvement, or last two things rather, because whenever you present your work, it has a fascinating and very powerful comparative, transnational, and supranational elements. So you have this unique ability to put together different developments in Turkey, in Latin America, in Venezuela, for instance, in Russia, Hungary, United States, United Kingdom, and at the same time, with very powerful socio-legal generalizations. So, do you believe that this transnational legal developments require new transnational methodology?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is, if you're going to take doctrine seriously, you need to speak languages.
Yeah.
This usually puts all Americans at a disadvantage, but finally I've got Hungarian and Russian in addition to French where I started. But there's only a certain number of languages you can probably speak, right? So there are going to be some systems that you can learn from the inside like this. And after that, you have to rely on your colleagues who have the interior view of other systems. But, learning languages, or how to put it, learning laws is very like learning languages. Once you learn a few, the other ones get easier because you can sort of see the structure from there, even if you can't speak it, right? And so you need not just one other, but at least, two or three other systems that you've learned from the inside where you can look up the laws and read the language. And after that, it gets a lot easier to understand the others. So, language, I keep saying that, in graduate schools, we should give people credit for learning languages the way we give people credit for learning quantitative methodology. To get good at a language, you need at least as much work as it takes to learn but that's a skill. And for socio-legal studies, languages are really crucial. Living places is crucial. Talking to your colleagues, like in the comparative common law world, because you're part of this web. I mean, when I have a question about Czech Republic, I talk to you. I mean, I know who to call, right? And say, this thing happened, the journalists are reporting it this way, but what's really happening? And then if you have a kind of repertoire of different systems in your head, you can try to assimilate what your colleagues tell you, what you can learn, from Google Translate's gotten a lot better, which I don't advocate. I mean, never rely on Google, just like never rely on Wikipedia without cross-checking your sources. On the other hand, it may be a useful place to start just so you know what you have to dive into. But you need that experience, and you particularly need languages.
Mhm, mhm.
And you need to know how lawyers think in these different places. So
That's
every
fascinating.
international trip is a chance to learn more. So that's
Yes.
why the pandemic is so weird. Like I've been home for 9 months. I never am home for 9 months, but my cat likes it. So,
Right, right.
and my husband too. He travels too.
It's no Schrodinger's cat, yeah, it's your cat. But I wonder, I think your research, your books, your studies are a wonderful combination of high, top academic quality, strong activist commitment with civic strong virtues. And I want to ask you the final question. How do you manage it to pull it together and at the same time keep it separate? And do you believe that there is some legal imagination, like Charles Wright Mills wrote about the sociological imagination? Do you think that there is some legal or constitutional imagination which could pull all these strings together without a disharmony?
Well, here too, again, the an imagination doesn't have to go in one track, right? So one thing about American legal academia, which I think is quite different, in even in the UK, let alone the continent, is that American legal academia is very normative. Every law review article ends with a, and now what should we do? So that's given me permission to be, what looks like activist, right? Because in fact, in American legal scholarship, that's really expected. So that was kind of a liberation from what happens in social science, where you point out the problems, you diagnose them, you conceptualize them, and then you offload it to somebody else, right? So different disciplines give you different tools for doing that. And the fact that I've held tenured positions in 3 different disciplines means that I can pick up and drop things in different places. Now, the dilemma then is, and there's also the transnational aspect. So things you can publish in the U.S. you didn't used to be able to publish in Europe. My European legal colleagues would say, "Well, you get to the end of this article, and then it's just like your opinion." And it's like, no, it's actually a normative analysis. There's a method for this, that you're not seeing. And so I mean, each of these different, I mean, every epistemic community, right? Let's talk sociology. So every discipline and every national version of a discipline is an epistemic community that has different ways of doing things. And the more you move across disciplinary boundaries and the more you move across national boundaries, the more resources you have for putting things together. So this is really, it's a bricolage of stuff that's well known in different places, and the hope is that, you have tolerant enough audiences that when they hit the part that's not part of their epistemic community, they give you the benefit of the doubt and keep reading. So that's what I hope for, and that's what I count on. So it's always nice to get a great audience.
Okay, wonderful. Kim, it would be very easy to talk longer and about many other things, but I think our format doesn't allow for it. I'm extremely grateful to you for coming online and delivering the 2020 annual lecture for the Center of Law and Society at Cardiff University. I'm equally grateful for this conversation, which will be available to our colleagues, to our students, to the whole socio-legal community. And we will be looking forward to see you face to face when this pandemic comes to its end. And with that, I want to wish you all the best and hope to see you soon.
Well, thank you. I hope I get to interview you one day because your life is more interesting than mine. So, and your work is really crossing all kinds of borders. So let's do this in reverse someday. I want everybody to learn about you.
Okay, one day. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
that's great.
Take
Okay,
care.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.